and that is already binding to the entries. That means that the email that is written inside of the email entry and the password that is written inside of the password entry are going to be bound to the properties of the user that comes from the main VM class. And then that same user is going to be bound as the parameter for the command, and that is why in the login command, more specifically in the canExecute method, we are getting that parameter as a user, and then using it to continue making some evaluations. So I am going to set a couple of breakpoints in my code to take a look at the functionality and whether or not the parameter is set to the correct values. And I am going to test this on the simulator. So here the application is starting up. And the first thing that happens is that the breakpoint for the canExecute method is hit. And that is because right from the beginning, the method wants to know if this can be executed. And because the parameter is null, the user is also going to be null, and we're going to get an exception. This exception is because we're trying to access one of the properties from a null element. So there is something else that we have to do. We have to evaluate if the user is equal to null. If it is, we're going to return false. If it isn't, the next lines are going to continue to be executed. So let's try this one more time. Now that we have evaluated if the user is null and return false in case of it is, the application is going to launch, the evaluation is going to be made, and because the email and the password are still going to be null, the result is going to be false. And notice what happens when the canExecute returns false. Because the binding of the command is set to the button and the canExecute is set to false, the button is actually inactive. We cannot click on it. And as soon as we change the values inside of the email and the password, this button should now be active because the canExecute should now return false. But it isn't. And that is because we're still lacking a couple of things. The first thing is the same thing that we were lacking once in one of the previous lectures, and that is that the current binding from the entries is set to the default, which is one way. And we have to change this to be two-way, so whenever the values inside of the text of the entries changes, so do the values for the property to which this is binding. The second thing is that we are currently binding to properties of the object, but changing a property doesn't change the object itself. So if the object doesn't change, the command parameter doesn't change, and so the canExecute method doesn't execute. So what we have to do is head back to the main view model and define a couple of properties, full properties. The first one is going to be a string for the email, and the second one is also going to be a string, but for the password. Now these two properties need to update the view every time they change, so we need to implement the iNotify property changed. We add the necessary using directive, and we implement it. With implementation, we have the event, and we can create a private void on property change method, which receives a string with a property name. In here, we first have to evaluate if the event has any subscribers, and if it does, we fire the event, just like we've been doing so far in the other two classes. And then we have to call this event from the setter of the password and from the setter of the email as well. But now what we have to do is make sure that whenever we update the email and the password, the user changes, so the canExecute method is fired. To do that, what I'm going to do is set the user to be equal to a new user. And this user is going to get its email value from this.email and its password value from this.password. So the main view model is going to have its own email and its own password. And then every time these values changes, a new user is going to be created. So I am going to copy this creation of a new user and paste it after setting the value as well. And now, back in the SAML file, instead of binding to the user.password, I am going to bind directly to the password, which is now a new property inside of the view model. and the same thing for the email. The command parameter is still going to be bound to the user, and now the user is not only going to be set from the constructor of the view model, but it's going to be initialized and set every time the password and the email change. And finally, we have to change the current user property to be a default property as well, which is going to be of type user. It has to remain the same. And from the setter, we also have to call the onPropertyChange method and pass user to the argument. And this is going to be executed every time we set a new user to the property, which is going to be in the setter for the email and in the setter for the password. And now I am going to run again on the simulator. I have the breakpoint ready inside of the can execute. So as soon as the application runs, it is going to execute twice. One, for the first time when the parameter is null. Second, when the user is set to a new user in the constructor of the main view model. And then every time we change the email, notice that the can execute method is executed again. And this time, the user is going to have the information that is written inside of the entries. Let me get rid of the breakpoint this time. The value is still going to be false because the password is still empty. But as soon as I write something on the password, notice that the button is active again. And let me write the correct email and password so I can log in. The button is active, I can click on it, I hit the breakpoint inside of the execute method, which means that this command is correctly bound, click on continue, and I get navigated to the home page, just like before. And if I try writing something that is not in the database, so the user cannot log in, and I click on login, we still see the error. So the functionality is still the exact same one that we had previously with an event handler, but this time we have moved all of the functionality to a better place, the view model, using commands and command parameters. We have already learned the two ways in which we can use commands, without a parameter and with a parameter. In the next lecture, you're going to have a challenge to replace all of the remaining event handlers for commands. Some of them are going to require parameters, some of them not.